This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nyssa, and it is limited review week for War of the Spark here on my channel. So far this week we've looked at the white, blue, black, and red cards in War of the Spark. Today we're looking at green, and tomorrow we'll wrap things up with this full set review by looking at all the other cards. The multicolored cards, the colorless cards, the lands, and so forth. After that I'll still have an archetype guide and a top 10 list and some other content coming out related to War of the Spark. So there's still that after this set review is concluded tomorrow. In these videos, I use a letter grade system to evaluate the cards, to explain how good a card is going to be. And if you're not sure what my letter grades mean, there should be a link in the description below taking you to a video that describes all of that. Right, now let's look at our first green card, which is Arboreal Glazer. These kinds of cards that allow you to put a land into play from your hand always look like they'll be better than they end up being. Don't get me wrong, playing them on turn 1 is nice, you get to ramp. But the best kind of ramp also gives you some card advantage, either through an elf that can produce green mana, as well as be a creature, or searching your library for a land and putting it into play. When it doesn't do that and requires you to have a land in your hand already, it means there are going to be lots of times where this does nothing. And I'm not saying this should cost 1 mana and search your library for a land or something crazy. I'm just saying this effect isn't as good as those other kinds of effects by a wide margin. I mean, even in the early game, it can happen if you're stuck on 2 or 3 mana and then you draw this, it's going to feel awful. It is a 0/3 with reach, which means it can block decently enough, even small flyers, but this card's usefulness goes from pretty nice on turn 1 to completely useless as early as turn 4 or 5. And a card with that big of a swing is hard to give a good grade to. I think running one of these might be alright, but I think it gets cut most of the time, and I don't think I ever feel good about playing it. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, we have Arlen, Voice of the Pack, who for 4 generic and 2 green is a legendary Planeswalker Arlen at uncommon, and she has a static ability, as all Planeswalkers in this set do, and it says each creature you control that's a wolf or a werewolf enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and she has a -2 that makes a 2/2 green wolf creature token. So for 6 mana, she immediately makes a 2/2 token, which is going to have a +1/+1 counter because of her static ability, so she gives you a 3/3. That protects her and may even make it so that she can make 3 of these 3/3s, because if she stays in play, that's what you're going to get to do, and that's pretty great for 6 mana. In general, though, I feel like if you manage to just make 2 with her, you're probably feeling alright about your situation, and she, of course, also has some synergy with other wolves, like the next card we're going to look at, and she also has some synergy with Proliferate because of the +1/+1 counters. If we sort of pretend she isn't a Planeswalker and say an enchantment for 6 that makes a 3/3 3 turns in a row, that'd be a pretty nice card and a source of card advantage. Obviously, that is the ideal scenario, and she won't always be able to do that, but I think she's pretty good, and a card that you're willing to first pick in some weaker packs. I'm giving her a B-. Next up, we have Arlen's Wolf, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 wolf at common, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. We've seen this ability a lot. I feel like it needs to be keyworded, and it's mostly on green cards, and it feels like a nice green way to be evasive, and that's pretty cool. But anyway, it's keyword, whether or not this should be a keyword aside, a 3 mana 3/2 that can't be blocked by smaller creatures is pretty nice. Sometimes your 3/2 gets in trouble against a couple of 1/3s, and this prevents that. It isn't anything special, but it's a quality 3-drop for green decks. I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, we have Awakening of Vitu-Ghazi, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a rare instant, and it says, put 9 +1/+1 counters on target land you control. It becomes a legendary 0/0 elemental creature with haste named Vitu-Ghazi. It's still a land. So I think this is pretty good. 5 mana for a 9/9 with haste is great, though you basically need 6 mana for it to either attack or block right away. It's a big dumb vanilla creature, but the efficiency makes that okay as well as the instant speed. It does have the additional downside over a regular 5 mana 9/9, because those exist, that if your opponent can kill it, they also make you lose a land, but I think that's fine. Being able to ambush your opponent's best creature with your 9/9 and then on your turn attack with it is going to feel pretty good. If you get to do that, you're going to be in great position. This is first pickable for sure, and a B+. I don't quite want to make it a bomb. It doesn't have the evasiveness that most bombs need to have. It just has efficiency. But, I could see maybe going all the way up to A- on it. Regardless, it's a really good card. You'll first pick it most of the time you see it. Next up, we have Band Together, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says up to 2 target creatures you control each deal damage equal to their power to another target creature. This seems like a card that might confuse a lot of people at the pre-release, and the first time I read it, it confused me. But up front, note this does not let you target 2 different creatures of your opponents. That would obviously be an insane card. Instead, you target 2 of your creatures, who then do damage equal to their combined power to 1 creature your opponent controls. Now that that's clear, this is still an excellent common for green. We have seen instant speed versions of this effect before, and they all only allowed you to target 1 creature on your side to do the damage. This lets you do even more damage, allowing your 2 smallish creatures to take down one of your opponent's much larger creatures. Being instant speed is just huge on a card like this too, since it comes with the inherent risk of getting you blown out if your opponent can kill one of your creatures when you play it. But because it's an instant, you have a much larger window where you can make it work safely, like if your opponent taps out at the end of your turn, for example. This seems like a premium removal spell to me, at least as close as green gets to it most of the time. Sure, you have to have creatures, but that requirement is easily fulfilled. I think this is first pickable in some weaker packs, which means it's a B-. Next up, we have Bloomhulk, who for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 plant elemental at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you proliferate. The 4-mana 4/4 isn't something you get real often at common and limited, and it's probably at least a C, but then you add proliferate, which means you'll be able to get additional value out of this a decent percentage of the time. And green has a bunch of +1/+1 counters, and the set has planeswalkers in it. This makes it a pretty great common for green decks, and one I think you're happy to first pick in some weaker packs. I think it's another B-. Next up, we have Bond of Flourishing, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. And it says, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a permanent card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. You gain 3 life. This reminds me a lot of cards like Adventurous Impulse and Anticipate, which means it's a fine card to include, can help you dig into whatever you really need, unless it's not a permanent, but it isn't anything amazing. I do like that it gains you 3 life, so that if doing this means you are going to be behind on board a bit, you at least gain some life to help soften that blow. And yeah, it can only hit permanents, but that's most of your deck, so I think that's alright. This is probably something you run as a 22nd or 23rd card, but it's going to be easy to cut, and I think that makes it a C-. Next up, we have Centaur Nurturer, who for 3 generic and a green is a 2/4 Centaur Druid at common. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life, and it can tap to add 1 mana of any color. I'm a pretty big fan of this green common, too. Green has some strong commons. This has decent stats, vanilla test-wise, gains you life when it comes down, and blocks reasonably, and it provides fixing and ramp. I mean, if this were just a 3 and a green for a 2/4 that gained you 3 life when it came into play, it would still be pretty good. Or if it were 4 mana 2/4 that added 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, it would be pretty good. Both of those cards are probably a C+. With both of those things going on, this is easily a B- and something that you consider first picking. Next up, we have Challenger Troll, who for 4 generic and a green is a 6/5 troll at uncommon, and it says each creature you control with power 4 or greater can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. This is really good. On its own, it's a 5 mana 6/5 that can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. That's already a very good card because a creature of this size has to be blocked by, at the minimum, a creature that is also his size, which usually means you're trading equally. Your opponent can't double block this with a couple of small creatures. They can't triple block it with 3 things with high toughness. There's not anything they can do here to interact with a Challenger Troll short of just chump blocking it or using their own large creature to kill it. And if that's what's going to happen, the worst case scenario is your opponent blocks with their big creature and you trade. You're going to feel fine about that because lots of times this will be able to attack and be able to threaten your opponent without them being able to chump block it. Add to that the fact that all creatures with power 4 or greater also get this bonus, and Challenger Troll coming down can really just mess up a board state for your opponent. Yeah, I think this is really good. It's one of the better uncommons in the set. I'm going to give it a B. I think that means it's first pickable frequently. Next, we have Courage in Crisis, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, then proliferate. If this was just 3 mana to put a counter on something at sorcery speed, it would be an F. But you add proliferate to the mix and things get more interesting. Basically, at its worst, this gives you 2 +1/+1 counters at sorcery speed, and there will be plenty of times where it will add counters some other places too. That said, it does come with some pretty huge risk in that it can open you up to a 2-for-1 if you're not careful. I'm not sure this has a high enough ceiling to make it the kind of card you feel good about playing despite that risk, but obviously if your deck really gets there on counters, this will probably be pretty decent. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Evolution Sage, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 elf druid at uncommon, and it basically has landfall. In other words, whenever you play a land, something happens, and in this case, you proliferate. So 3 mana 3/2 is not very good, and something you only include when desperate, but obviously this brings way more to the table than that. Landfall for proliferate seems pretty nice, especially because green seems especially interested in +1/+1 counters, and obviously all decks will have, 2 to 3 planeswalkers. So yeah, this could make some board states really get out of hand after a couple of land drops. Most green decks will have at least a few reasons to proliferate, and in some decks, this will just get insane. Overall, I think you can spend a first pick on this and feel good about it. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Finale of Devastation, which for X generic mana and 2 green is a mythic rare sorcery. And it says, search your library and or graveyard for a creature with converted mana cost X or less and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. If X is 10 or more, creatures you control get +X/+X and gain haste until end of turn. So this is pretty good. I mean, the ability to bring back a creature from your graveyard, is nice. It's nice that it comes directly into play. That's what really makes sure this thing is pretty good. The ability to search your library for a creature card and put it into play is really good. This will probably be better maybe in constructed formats where you can sort of construct your deck in such a way that you have a bunch of silver bullets, cards that you can search up for certain situations. But I think even in limited, the ability to do that is actually quite good. I do think this is a little bit costly in the fact that, if you pay 5 mana, all you can get is a card with converted mana cost 3 or less, which isn't great. But I think the flexibility it gives you to search up a creature that will be ideal for the board state, and the fact that it scales as the game goes on, and, again, like all of these finales, and this is the last one in the cycle, you're not going to get to X is 10 or more very often. Obviously, if you do, this is completely absurd. This one just wins you the game on the spot, as most of them do. But I don't think it's quite as good as most of the other finales are on their own. But, I think it is pretty good. I think it's worth first picking. I'm going to give it a B-. If there's a card that's going to slip, it might be this one, though, and it may go down to a C or C+. I wouldn't be super shocked, but I'm interested in playing this and seeing if the flexibility is, in fact, worth it. Next up, we have Forced Landing, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says put target creature with flying on the bottom of its owner's library. This is an interesting version of the green flyer hate card that every set has. Instead of just straight plummet, this lets you put the creature on the bottom of their library, which is sometimes better, like if the creature has a death trigger, or your opponent has ways to get stuff back from the graveyard. Still, this is most likely a sideboard card, though a good one, as plummet often is. I think you can mainboard it, but you're only going to do it if you're desperate, and that means it's a D+. There are enough creatures with flying that it isn't completely unplayable in your mainboard, though. I think it's a C+ out of your sideboard, though, and I think generally it's the kind of sideboard card you're always going to want. Next up, we have Giant Growth, which for 1 green mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. Giant Growth is back. We don't see combat tricks like this very often anymore. A single mana giving such a massive power toughness boost is good and will make a creature capable of winning almost any combat. The opportunity cost of leaving up 1 green mana for that effect is also really low, and the upside here is very high. It is still a combat trick, so it has some issues of being situational and it's easy to get blown out on, but it's probably the best combat trick in the entire set, and I think that means it's a C+ instead of just the regular C that most decent combat tricks get. I think you feel pretty good in your aggressive green deck about running like 3 of these. Next up, we have God Eternal Ronus, who for 3 generic and 2 green is a mythic rare zombie god. He's a 5/5, he's got Death Touch, and when he enters the battlefield, you double the power of each other creature you control until end of turn. Those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn, and then he's got the God Clause. If he dies or gets exiled, he goes back to the top of your 3 deep, of your library. Like all the gods, this is a bomb. A 5 mana 5/5 with Death Touch is nice, although admittedly, Death Touch on huge creatures doesn't come up very much, but, it is something. The real power here comes from the Enter the Battlefield ability, which makes your board incredibly frightening by doubling their power. They also gain Vigilance, which means that you can always play this, swing with your whole board, and still be able to block effectively if you're in a race. Now, Ronus does ask that you have some board state to take advantage, but it doesn't seem a stretch to have like a 2/2 and a 3/3 in play when you play this, and on turn 5, those creatures will be able to attack for up to 10 damage. He also tucks himself back into your library if he's exiled or destroyed, of course, and that's nice, especially because he has an Enter the Battlefield ability, and if you get to use it again, your opponent's going to be in a world of hurt. Overall, though, I think the fact that he asks for a board state, he doesn't have an evasive ability, I do think those things hold him from being a straight-up A, but, he's still an A- and one of the best cards in the entire set. Next up, we have Jiang Yanggu, Wildcrafter, who for 2 generic and a green is a legendary planeswalker at uncommon. A Yanggu is his subtype. He's got 3 loyalty when he comes into play. His static ability says each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has tap, add 1 mana of any color, and he has a -1 ability that says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So this is a planeswalker who is definitely a +1/+1 counter build around. His static ability will be pretty nice in decks that get there on counters, and the fact that he can just sort of be a factory for mana and +1/+1 counters all on his own is great. You can also count him as a source of fixing, which is some nice utility. He is held back by low starting loyalty, and he asks that a creature already be in play, and he doesn't effectively protect himself, really. So I think in your typical green deck, he isn't great. Maybe a C, but I think there is a high ceiling here, and a deck that gets there on +1/+1 counters, he's probably closer to a B-. Next up, we have Crawl Stinger, who for 2 generic and a green is a 2/2 insect assassin at common, and it has Death Touch. Seems like every set lately has a 3 mana 2/2 with Death Touch. Like its predecessors, this card will be solid. Being able to trade for anything is always nice, and it's a C. Next, we have Wrangler, who for 1 generic and a green is a 2/1 human warrior at common. It's got Trample, and it says whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Wrangler. So a 2 mana 2/1 with Trample is probably like a D+. But if you add this other text to it, and it becomes a good deal better. Obviously, this is best suited to a red-green deck where there are the most ferocious payoffs and creatures with 4 or more power at lower rarities, but the fact that this gets bigger in the late game is nice when coupled with the fact that it can do some damage or trade early. I think this is a solid C. Next up, we have Mowu, Loyal Companion, who for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon legendary hound. It's a 3/3, it comes with Trample and Vigilance, and it says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on Mowu Loyal Companion, that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. Like his owner, Mowu is a +1/+1 counter build around. Most green decks in this format will at least have a few +1/+1 counter things going on, so he is probably pretty solid in most of the green decks in this format, something like a C. However, if you get enough ways to put counters on things, I think he goes all the way up to a B-, and I think that probably means he's worth spending a first pick on. I could honestly see him going to like a C+ in a regular deck and a solid B in a +1/+1 counter deck too. It may be better than I'm expecting. But, 4 mana 3/3 Trample Vigilance, if that's all he is, that's probably really just a C. But I think usually he'll be a little more than that. Next up, we have New Horizons, which for 2 generic and a green is an aura at common. It has enchant land, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and enchanted land has tap, add 2 mana of any 1 color. This was a nice card last time we saw it. Ramping, fixing, and a +1/+1 counter is some decent value. Most of these sorts of enchant land spells don't impact the board at all, so making one of your creatures bigger is nice to do on a card that's also giving you fixing and ramp. Green has access to a fair bit of fixing in this set, and I think New Horizons will help make it easy for those decks to play multiple colors. I don't think you want to take this early, but once it becomes clear you want to play multiple colors, you should value these pretty highly. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Nyssa, who shakes the world, who for 3 generic and 2 green is a rare planeswalker, Nyssa, with 5 loyalty when she comes into play. Her static ability allows you to add an additional green mana whenever you tap a forest for mana. Her +1 puts 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. You untap it, it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste that's still a land. Note that does not end at the end of turn. And her ultimate says you get an emblem, and it's a -8 ultimate. You get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. So, Nyssa is going to be shaking the world when she comes down. Her static ability giving you a bunch of extra mana might not always matter by the time you play her, but I feel like there are enough activated abilities and big fatties around that it could. But she is powerful because she can really effectively protect herself by animating your lands. Even giving them vigilance means they can play both offense and defense. Her ultimate making all your animated lands indestructible and all your other lands too, I guess, is nice, but her ultimate's really not going to be that great and limited. It seems like the kind of ultimate that they printed for Commander where, actually searching your library for every forest could matter. It's not going to matter most of the time in limited, but, if you get there, it's not going to hurt, again, to make all of your lands indestructible who are 3/3s. She is the kind of walker who can protect herself and then snowball advantage for you as more and more creatures join your side of the table, and she ticks up in loyalty. She seems like a windmill slam first pick. She's a solid A. Next up, we have Nyssa's Triumph, which for 2 green mana is an uncommon sorcery, and it says search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards. If you control a Nyssa Planeswalker, instead search your library for up to 3 land cards. Reveal those cards, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. So paying 2 mana to draw 2 cards is usually good, even when both those cards are forests. It helps make sure you hit your land drops, and that can be nice. That said, this does cost double green and only gets more green mana, which isn't a bad thing. It just means that it isn't super flexible, and playing it on turn 2 is far from a guarantee. I see no reason you wouldn't play this in a deck that is heavy green, like 10 or more forests, but you probably don't always get to play it if green is like your secondary color, and I think that holds it down to a C. Next up, we have Paradise Druid, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/1 elf druid at uncommon, and it has hexproof as long as it's tapped, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. This is great. So one of the annoying things about mana dorks can be that you play them and they have not the greatest stats, so your opponent can take it down with basically any removal spell, and that would be true of a 2/1. And then you don't have the mana that you were eagerly planning on having for your next turn to ramp out something awesome. We've all been there where we're like, all right, I got to play my Lawn of War Elves, I'm going to play a 4-drop now on turn 3, it's going to be great. And then your opponent kills it, and it's very deflating. Paradise Druid does not let that happen since she has hexproof. She almost guarantees you'll get to make some mana your next turn. On top of that, she does have reasonable-ish stats that you can send into combat if you desperately have to, and she produces mana of any color. She's a great uncommon. She provides fixing for you and ramp for you, and she's always going to make sure you get that mana, unlike most mana dorks. I think all that makes her a great uncommon. It's in the conversation for one of the best ones in the set, and it's a B+. Next up, we have Plane-Wide Celebration, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a rare sorcery, and it says choose 4. You may choose the same mode more than once. So these modes are create a 2/2 citizen creature token that's all colors, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, proliferate, or you gain 4 life. This looks like a ton of fun, like, a celebration even. Sure, it costs 7 mana, but you're going to get 7 mana worth of value out of this. The thing I really like about it is that you can sculpt the card to be whatever you need it to be, and you're still getting good value. Whether you need some 2/2s to hold down the board or threaten your opponent, to return powerful cards from your graveyard, to add +1/+1 counters to all your creatures that have +1/+1 counters, or gain life, all of which will have their place, this will be what you need it to be, and it always will be. And that's great, because sometimes big, expensive cards can't help you if you're in a bad enough situation. Chances are good that this will help you no matter how bad things look. It does cost 7 mana, but green has reasonable ramp, and this format doesn't look blistering fast, so I'm going to say that I'd feel alright about first picking this, despite being 7 mana, just because it's either going to pull you to parity, pull you out of parity, or just win you the game, if that's, what's going on. And while it is a bomb, and I'm sort of tempted to give it sort of a bombier grade, I do think it stops short of being a straight-up bomb just because of its high cost, but I could see it maybe being one. 7 mana things are sometimes hard to give a bomb grade to. I mean, how often do we see a 7 mana card that gets an A or A-? Not very often. I think this gets close, though, at B+. Next up, we have Pollenbright Druid, who for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 elf druid at common. When it enters the battlefield, you have 2 choices. One is you put a counter on target creature. The other is proliferate. So a 2 mana 1/1 that puts a counter anywhere, including itself, is usually a pretty decent card already. Like the Beetle that we recently saw. At worst, it's going to be a Grizzly Bears, and there are other times where putting the counter elsewhere is a bigger deal, like on an evasive creature. But this set has a ton of proliferate, so those counters are even better than usual. Additionally, this can proliferate for you too, which you'll be doing if you already have other counters in play. Either way, you're going to get some value out of your 2-drop in the late game, and that's not always easy to come by. This is a good common for green decks, and I think you'd happily run like 4 or 5 of these because they're decent on turn 2, and with all the +1/+1 counters and planeswalkers, proliferate's going to be good in the late game. I think this is another common for green that I think you consider first picking, which means it's a B-. Next up, we have Primordial Worm, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/6 worm at common. It's just a big vanilla creature. So, 7/6 for 6 is some decent vanilla stats. I would rather have Colossal Dreadmaw because it has trample, but the Primordial Worm is a fine common curve topper to have in your deck. It's a C. Next up, we have Return to Nature, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says choose one. Destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or exile target card from a graveyard. Well, this is a nice flexible sideboard card. It's a strictly better naturalize because it can do the normal naturalize effect while also being able to exile a problem card from the graveyard. Even with that third option though, I'm not thinking this will be worth playing in your main 40 cards most of the time, because there will be plenty of opponents where they have 1 to 2 cards that this does something to, and it will rot in your hand in those situations. This set also does not have a lot of artifacts or enchantments, making it probably less mainboardable than usual. So I think it is a D if you played in your main deck, and a C+ out of your sideboard. It's just nice that it can deal with multiple strategies instead of just artifacts and enchantments. Sometimes exiling that card will matter too. Next up, we have Snare Spinner, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 spider at common. It's got reach, and whenever it blocks a creature with flying, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This does a pretty nice job of holding down the skies, effectively being able to block both 1 and 2 power flyers and killing most of them, and able to trade with lots of 3 power flyers. This is a solid 2-drop. Green decks sometimes really struggle at holding back flyers, and this fits that role quite nicely. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Steady Aim, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. It says untap target creature. It gets +1/+4 and gains a reach until end of turn. I never really liked this kind of combat trick. I mean, it'll make your creature survive combat frequently, but the lower power boost makes it so maybe you can't pump your creature big enough for it to matter. It can also be used in response to damage-based removal and likely save your creature. The untap part can be nice because it means you can use it defensively. What I don't love is that it isn't that exciting on offense, and generally you want your combat trick to produce blowouts on the attack, like blowing up double blocks, which this can't do quite as effectively. I think it's an okay trick, but I think it's the kind that you cut pretty easily, especially because green has giant growth, which is like miles better than this. I'm going to give it a D+. Next up, we have Storm the Citadel, which for 4 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, until end of turn, creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, destroy target artifact or enchantment defending player controls. This isn't awesome and limited. 5 for +2/+2 at sorcery speed for your whole team is nothing special. An evasive ability like Trample or something like Vigilance added to it would make it a lot better. As it is, I don't see the combat trigger on this card mattering in most games. As we've said, there aren't that many enchantments or artifacts in this yet. I'm not super impressed by this, even if your deck can go wide. That said, it isn't like this is terrible. You will play it in decks that can go wide. It just isn't the mass pump effect you would really want to have to make your deck come together. It's just a mediocre one that, yeah, when your board is big will mean you win the game, but because of the limitations of what it grants, the board being right for you to just win the game on the spot won't come up with regularity because of the lack of evasion. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, we have Thundering Ceratok, who for 4 generic and a green is a 4/5 Rhino at common with Trample, and when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control gain Trample until end of turn. I think a 5-mana 4/5 with Trample would already be a C. It is a body big enough that Trample really means something. Making it so this also gives Trample to your whole team is nice, though it is worth noting that I would guess around 50% of the time you play this, that won't matter much. There will be times when it does, just don't expect it to be a huge play all the time, and don't value it that way because it's just not going to be awesome all the time. Still, it seems like a good card for green decks in the format, and having exactly 4 power is nice for the ferocious payoffs in the set. I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have Vivian, Champion of the Wilds, who for 2 generic and a green is a legendary planeswalker Vivian at rare. She's got 4 loyalty when she comes into play, and her static ability says you may cast creature spells as though they had flash. Her +1 says until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gains vigilance and reach. And her -2 says look at the top 3 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. For as long as it remains exiled, you may look at that card and you may cast it if it's a creature card. The static ability here, I think, is actually where you get most of the value, as putting flash on big creatures can often result in those creatures becoming removal spells. Your opponent will have to think twice about attacking you or Vivian if you have untapped mana, and even 1 card in hand, so probably a good time to hold on to basic lands once you get her into play. Her +1 isn't the most exciting thing, though it does kind of help protect her, since Vigilance means you can attack without worrying about the crackback, and Reach means that flyers will be held in check too. That said, you do need to have creatures in play for it to work out. Her -2 is solid too. You'll usually hit a creature with that -2. There will be times when you don't, since it's only the top 3 cards, and that will be painful, really painful, when you give up loyalty and don't get anything out of it. But most of the time, you'll be able to hit a creature out of it, and that'll be another creature that you can play at instant speed, and it's not even really in your hand, and your opponent might forget about it. But it doesn't seem amazing to me. I think the big risk of whiffing on her -2 and the fact that her +1 isn't incredible, though it does help protect her if you have creatures in play, I think that keeps her from being a planeswalker you want to first pick. I think she is a C+. I can maybe see being wrong here just because she's so cheap. Maybe she gets down before your opponent has any board at all, and you can just start going crazy with her. But I don't love her. I think C+ is where I'll start her. Next up, we have Vivian's Arcbow, which for 1 generic and a green is a legendary artifact at rare. You can pay X, tap it, and discard a card to look at the top X cards of your library. You may put a creature card with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This card's interesting. I think it's the kind of card that can give you some pretty absurd late game value. Like if you're flooding out, the Arcbow will give you something to do, and it's something pretty powerful. If the game reaches the late game and you have an Arcbow in play, you're probably going to win. The problem, though, is you're not going to really be able to use this at all early, but I do think that's okay. It's still going to be good later in the game. I mean, ideally, this isn't what you're playing on turn 2, but if you don't have anything else to play, I guess you could do worse. But because it's really only going to be at its best, in the later part of the game, I think that does keep it from being like a card you can rate highly. I think it's just a C+, with, the caveat that if you have this in play on turn 10 and you have like 7 lands in play, you're probably going to win the game. But if you play it early, and your opponent just kills you before you get there, and that can definitely happen because it's going to basically be a dead card until the really late game. Next up, we have Vivians Grizzly, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 Bear Spirit at common. It has an activated ability where you can pay 3 generic and a green and look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature or planeswalker, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. If you don't put the card in your hand, put it on the bottom of your library. Like her Arcbow, her Grizzly also is a nice mana sink, though less reliable than the legendary artifact. But still, this is basically a really bad Duskwatch Recruiter. The Recruiter was an absurd limited card, so being a bad version of it doesn't mean the card itself is bad. It has all right stats and the ability to draw you cards sometimes in the late game, and you certainly don't want to run this unless you can get, 15 plus creatures and or planeswalkers, but I think it's a solid card for most green decks. I'm giving it a C. It's also worth noting, by the way, that if you're flooding, this can actually help you get out of that because you get to put the card on the bottom of your library. It is kind of annoying that if what you really want is a land, you still have to put it on the bottom. So that's, it sort of it counters one another. But most of the time, if you're in a position where you're using this activated ability, it's going to be late enough in the game that, you're happy to put lands on the bottom. But still, I think it's just a solid C. Next up, we have Ward Scale Crocodile, which is also our last green card. For 4 generic and a green, it is a 5/3 Crocodile at common, and it has Hexproof. Wizards keeps printing these Hexproof common creatures, and this one actually has some aggressive stats. I mean, it does die in combat pretty easily, but because it has Hexproof, you can make sure that it only dies in combat when it is beneficial for you, like killing a creature with 5 toughness. Then there is the usual upside that Hexproof creatures bring. Risky spells like fight cards or tricks become a lot better because your opponent won't be able to easily 2-for-1 you. That said, this set does not have any auras that are going to augment this thing, so you're probably going to be more interested in putting +1/+1 counters on him and making him crazy and hard to kill that way. Still, I think this is just a C, with the caveat that if your deck ends up with enough ways to abuse Hexproof, probably gets better. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about the remaining cards in the set, the colorless cards, multicolored cards, and the lands. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of my set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the playlist that has the rest of the set review in it, it'll be on your screen in just a few seconds. Thanks for watching.